to another episode of the Sefer Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored in thanks to Zalmi Jacobs for introducing us to this fascinating podcast by Adam Kaplan and William Spielvogel. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by the men's division of Sarah Schneer. If you're exploring the idea of earning a degree but aren't sure where to start, you're not the only one. Maybe you're wondering whether your yeshiva credits will count, how to navigate financial aid, or which program actually leads to a career. That's where the men's division of Sarah Schneer can help. With degree paths in accounting, business, ABA, pre-med, psychology, paralegal, special education, and social work, you'll earn a degree from one of their prestigious partner colleges and be supported all the way through. From expert academic advising to a strong group of peers who learn and grow together, the experience is designed to help you succeed. And when you're ready to take the next step, their advisors are there to guide you, helping you choose the program that fits your goals and walking you through every stage of the process. Applications are open now for the fall semester. Visit their website, www.sarash.com, that's SARASCH.com, or call 917-209-8204 to speak with a helpful advisor today, and you can find that information in the show notes. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the link and information in the show notes. You can also find the link in the show notes to join the Sefarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sefarim, book deals, and so on, as well as the new Sefarim Chatter WhatsApp status, where I post similar things as the WhatsApp community, as well as book giveaways. Finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Joseph A. Skloot, who is the Rabbi Aaron D. Painkin Assistant Professor of Modern Jewish Intellectual History at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, mouthful, and is the author of the newly published book, First Impressions, Sefer Chasidim, and Early Modern Hebrew Printing, which is about Sefer Chasidim, which we'll be discussing. The book is about Sefer Chasidim and Early Modern Hebrew Printing. I guess I just repeated the title, but your listeners will understand. My point is we'll be talking about Sefer Chasidim itself in the beginning, and also about the printed editions, mainly the first and the second edition of Sefer Chasidim, and how Sefer Chasidim came to be a book, and we'll explain what that means. So thank you, Professor Skloot, for joining me.
It's an honor to be here, Nafi. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start. I'll tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm a historian. I'm a historian of Jewish culture. When I was undergraduate, I became interested in a few different ideas that ended up as the confluence leading to this book. The first was this question of the impact of printing. That was a major fascination of mine from those years, a number of years ago now, and what exactly printing did. Not only to Jewish text, to Hebrew text, but to literature more broadly. So I was introduced to that question. I was also, as an undergraduate, introduced to this book known as Sefer Chasidim, and that was because one of my professors was engaged. Peter Schaefer was engaged in a major project, which may come up in our conversation, to collect and transcribe all of the Sefer Chasidim manuscripts available. A number of my friends worked on that project. So I became aware of this book known as Sefer Chasidim then as well. And this developed in graduate school when I became particularly interested in the period known as the early modern. The early modern being that period roughly between 1492 and 1789. 1492, the expulsion from Spain, the Western imperialism and exploration in the New World, and 1789, the French Revolution, the beginnings, the stirrings of emancipation. I became interested in this period because it is something of a transitional period. There are many figures who represent a kind of modernity, if we want to understand modernity as beginning in 1789 and afterwards, but who seem modern before their time, right? That there are many unusual figures in this period. There are many developments in Jewish history and European history that paved the way for the events of the modern period. So I became interested in this period in the early modern, and then the question became, what was my research going to be? And the focus became on the role of printing and Sefer Chasidim together.
Yeah, so this is very much a book about printing. I was telling you before, we could talk more about this. It reminds me of recently when I had Dr. Yaakov Meir on about his book about Tfus Rishon, about the first print of Yerushalmi, similar type of thing. So although Sefer Chasidim is from the Tkuvas Rishonim, from the times of the Rishonim and the Chasidei Ashkenaz, but your book and your research is focused on the first editions, Bologna 1538, Bologna is in Italy, Basel, Switzerland 1580, and we're going to talk about those editions. But just to clarify, so Sefer Chasidim and Chasidei Ashkenaz, how do you get there specifically? Because although you're focused on later, I mean, your research does have a lot to do with Sefer Chasidim. You had to learn a lot about Sefer Chasidim and Chasidei Ashkenaz, even though you were interested in early modern period. So it's kind of like both together.
Yes, exactly right. I mean, I guess I represent that transitional figure between the medieval and the modern in my own person, in my scholarship, for better or for worse. You're 100% right. How did I get to Sefer Chasidim? So I was aware of this, right? I was aware of this book. And I was aware of this effort to collate the manuscripts. And then the question was, if I was going to try to figure out what exactly printing did to Hebrew texts, to Hebrew literature, and to the canonical Hebrew literature, or literatures that have acquired a canonicity, I needed a test case, right? I needed a way of pinpointing. So what was this book before printing and what was this book after printing? To demonstrate the effect of printing on the literature. And it turned out Sefer Chasidim was a perfect book for this enterprise. Perfect because we have this very extensive manuscript history, about 20 manuscripts they're found all over the world, that have been transcribed, digitized, collated, searchable now, primarily as a result of the work of Peter Schaefer, but also the work of Ivan Marcus as well. And so it was very convenient to be able to have access to this manuscript history all in one. And then to be able to go and to compare it to the printed editions that emerge in the 16th century. I should say the 16th century is really important because while printed Hebrew books emerge in the 15th century, right, the first printed Hebrew books emerge in the 15th century, those are editions of Hebrew books that are primarily, there are a lot of Sidurim and Machzorim in that period. They're not great numbers of them. We call this the period of the incunabula. That is the first printed books, and they look a lot like manuscripts. But in the 16th century, we see printed books that look a lot more like the printed books that you and I are familiar with. And so the 16th century is a particular import for that reason. Also, I should say there are two editions of Sefer Chasidim produced in the 16th century, the ones that you mentioned, right? Bologna and Basel, 1538 and 1580. And those two editions are also easily compared, right? And in between the publication of those two editions was the burning of the Talmud, which occurs in a number of Italian cities, the prohibition of reading and burning of the Talmud, and the burning of the Talmud. And so the second edition happens after that burning. And so one can pose the question, well, after that traumatic event, what impact might have that experience had on this new edition of a book that was printed for the first time before?
So there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll get through to that throughout. Let's talk about Sefer Chasidim. As you mentioned, Chasidei Ashkenaz, it's written by, let's start off, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, but then I'll say, I'll qualify and say maybe, purportedly, and that's a big part of the story. This attribution to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid is a big part of this story. But let's give an overview of Sefer Chasidim, who purportedly wrote it, what it is, maybe an example or two, just for those that aren't familiar. Let's work through it, and then we'll get to more after that.
Sure. So this is a book, and I use that term advisedly because of the later. In a few moments, we'll explain why. But for the moment, let's just say this is a book, asterisk, that is a product of a particular culture, although not entirely. What we call the Chasidei Ashkenaz, right? The German pietists. This medieval culture. But what is notable about this book, first of all, is that it is a patchwork. It is composed of many different kinds of texts. And that is even if you just go and pull off your edition from the Mossad Rav Kook, or you don't need any fancy, you don't even need to look at the manuscripts. Just look at the standard edition, and what you see is you have quotations, lengthy quotations from Rambam. You have quotations from Sadia. You have quotations. You have texts that say this is a tshuva of the Beit Din of Regensburg. You have texts that are, well, certainly you have texts that are repeat or adapt material from Chazal. So you have text. This is a book that is composed of a patchwork of texts, and some of these texts are rather well known. For instance, you have the very famous advice to someone who is concerned about. This is appropriate for the season that we're in. Concerned about some of the sins that they have committed, and so the rabbi advises him to go out into the freezing cold snow and to sit in the freezing cold snow or put his hands in ice so that his hands freeze as a form of corporeal repentance, right? And that's a very famous. Or very. You have the story of the shepherd who doesn't know the tefillot, right? But famously, he's out in the fields and he says, "Holy One of Blessing, all this beautiful world is your creation." I'm paraphrasing here, and then the rabbi comes and says, "That's nice, but let me teach you some of the prayers." The traditional prayers, and then but the shepherd is not a great student, and he quickly forgets the prayers, but also has forgotten his first initial spontaneous prayer. And the moral of the story is, of course, that the initial prayer with all of its kavanah is superior to the keva, which is actually very easily forgotten in the case of such a person. So these are stories that have made their way into the folkloric tradition of and the halachic, or the minhagim, not the halacha, but the minhagim at various points and have had an impact. And they are found within Sefer Chasidim, along with a whole host of other things as well. Without belaboring the point, I'll just say there's my book is full of quotations dealing with references to books in Sefer Chasidim, because this is a book also. Sefer Chasidim is a book about books, and there's all kinds of rules that are described about how books should be treated. There's almost an obsession with books here, and I would say that it's like a particular Jewish kind of bibliophilia, which, by the way, I also I'm afflicted with, and that's also one of the reasons why this book is of interest to me, is this sense of devotion to the written word is throughout the text.
Yeah, the host has the same affliction book collecting, and I'm sure many listeners of this podcast have the same bibliophilic, bibliographic, whatever, between the term, but the same issue, or all bibliophiles. So let's talk about Sefer Chasidim a little more. Sefer Chasidim, I think you mentioned this, but is a book. But Professor Ivan Marcus, who you mentioned him, has this theory. Others also. We could just talk a little bit more about Sefer Chasidim before we get into what you talk about in the book as an open book. So as we said, Sefer Chasidim, and we'll really get to this more later. It's attributed and purportedly written by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. But whether that or not, there's this kind of, is it, and we can talk about I think at this point it's worth talking about the different manuscripts, and I can just say briefly, we can talk about it. There's the standard Sefer Chasidim, which is what we're going to discuss what that means, the first two editions. And okay, let's just, for listeners' sake, let's just assume for a second it's the Mosadov Cook one. I know that's not exactly. And then you have the Parma one, which was published first in the late 19th century, which is a completely different book. And Sefer Chasidim is made up, like you said, of stories. They're kind of, let's say, passages for listeners, and it's simanim. And then there's just thousands of different ones. It's just a totally different book. So essentially, Professor Marcus has this open book theory. If you could explain what that is and what that means.
So the way that Sefer Chasidim is constructed, as you said, it's made up of passages, simanim, little blocks of text, okay? Or sometimes longer blocks of text, but nothing too long. In our nothing more than a few pages. And Professor Marcus, Ivan Marcus, has offered and Professor Schaefer, Peter Schaefer has as well, have each in different ways, have given the suggestion that basically that in the medieval world, this Sefer Chasidim was an open book, meaning that you had many different manuscripts, versions, many different, we might want to use the word editions of something known as Sefer Chasidim, each with different blocks of text, each with different simanim that circulated, okay, that traveled around the medieval world. And that's why we have about 20 manuscripts, which are different from each other, from the medieval period of Sefer Chasidim, right? They're not all the same. They are actually very, very different from each other. They have different material. In 1538, a group of scholars in the city of Bologna in Italy produced a version of Sefer Chasidim, which we call the first edition, the first printed edition, the Editio Princeps. And this edition became the standard edition of Sefer Chasidim until 1891, when a new edition was published based on a manuscript, one of those manuscripts from the Parma, the Biblioteca Parma Palatina Library. And Yehuda Vistinetsky publishes this edition in 1891. And it's a much longer edition than what was published in Bologna. I should say that between 1538 and 1891, there were about 50 different other editions of Sefer Chasidim published, but most of them, they were all based on that Bologna edition, or the second edition, which is also based on the Bologna edition, the Basel edition. So the Bologna edition sets the standard up until 1891. In 1891, we have a new edition, which is much longer, which has many more passages, many more simanim. And that, at the time, people say, this is the real Sefer Chasidim. Will the real Sefer Chasidim please stand up? This is the real Sefer Chasidim from Parma. What is also notable is that the Mossad Rav Kook edition, which is the most common edition, it's the one that is anthologized in the Bar Ilan Responsa project. That edition with Reuven Margoliot's commentary, that edition is not based on the Parma edition. It is based on the Bologna tradition. So, to just summarize, we have in the medieval world up until 1538, there were many, what I like to call Sifrei Chasidim, that traveled around. And then something happened, and we get one Sefer Chasidim, and that's the one that everyone knows until 1891.
Yeah, so Professor Marcus's book and this theory of open book is kind of focused on the Rishonim as Sefer Chasidim. Well, your book picks up from there, essentially what you just said.
Exactly.
And how do we have our Sefer Chasidim today? Not the Parma one, because that's printed in 1891, as you said. But how do we have Sefer Chasidim? What happens that it goes from being an open book, which is additions being put in by everyone, again, all the Chassidim Ashkenaz running around, and then it ends up into one defined book. And you mentioned, I think, in the Kantian sense, like in Kant, a book. You can explain what that means. But I will mention also Parma is in Italy. It's not far from Bologna, interestingly.
Yes.
It's pretty close by. So let's talk about a book. So you go into this. What does it mean for a book? I'm holding your book in my hand, and it says First Impressions, book by Brandeis University Press, and the author is Joseph Skloot. And I have a book here with an introduction, and it's a whole thing. But that is a book in between these two boards or covers, the front and back covered with all the pages, the introduction and the index and everything in there, and the chapters in between. That's kind of a more modern thing. Can you explain a little bit what that means?
Exactly.
Explain that.
So when we have a book, you go into the bookstore and you buy a book, and the book seems to be a fixed text. It at least has the appearance of a fixed text. In fact, if you bought the first printing of first editions, right, my book today, and then, God willing, in let's say 20 years, it's still in print, and another edition is printed. My hope is you can make the assumption that it will be the same or almost the same as what was printed in 2023 this year, right? With other texts, standardization is a process that happens at a particular time. In the medieval world, Professor Marcus makes the claim that there were very few standardized texts, right? That there were very few standardized texts. That in fact, what happened was because there was no printing press, books were copied, and the people who copied them regularly added in their own thoughts and own ideas. And actually, a book that is canonical in the medieval world is one that actually keeps being copied and keeps being added to. There is no closure of books, as it were, no standardizing, as it were, in the medieval world, at least very rarely, right? But there are very, very few standard texts in the medieval world. You have a world of open texts. And then with printing, you have something akin to a closure, not entirely, but you have this beginnings of a standardization of our texts. You have the effort to give texts that previously may not have been tied to an individual, right? People might not have known that this book was the book of a certain person. There's the effort on the part of the printers to place the name of the author in big letters on the front cover, right? So everyone knows this is Joseph Skloot's book, right? Let no one doubt. There's the effort to give books specific titles, and that's where we get Sefer Chasidim, because Sefer Chasidim is very important because this book is known as Sefer Chasidim, right? But actually, you have variations in the medieval world on the title. Sefer Chasidut is one variation that you have in the medieval world. There's the question of that Hey HaYidiyah, Sefer HaChasidim, right? So there's that question. So the standardizing of the title, that is an effort of the printers as part of printing as well. So when we talk about a book, as a book in the Kantian sense, what we're talking about, a book has a text that is standardized, that is reproducible over and over again, one that has an author that is known and identified explicitly, and one that with the title is particularly important as well. There are other features too that we might want to allude to, we might come back to, but those are the core ones.
Right, and this is something that for us today, we assume that's what a book is. It's so when we're talking about this, it's like funny But that's what a book generally would be. And then sometimes you see new edition, updated edition, as opposed to the first edition. What that means is it's this book, but it's been updated, revised, added. That's what a book means to us today. And just to mention another famous work, Rashi al Torah on Chumash. I think, remember Professor Avram Grossman's book, I think 10 to 25% is estimated that's not Rashi. Again, there was copyists, this came from other Rishonim, but there's different parts in there. Everyone's familiar, I'm sure, basically with many different, and you also have a lot of, many Sfarim today, critical editions today, talking about Saraf Kok, and they have, the footnotes, and it's there, it's Hachi Garcia, this is the Gersa, this manuscript, because the difference is not necessarily as pronounced as thousands of different passages, but they had different, notes, things were different because they were copied. There may have been errors and whatever. Anyways, that's an important part to discuss here. So, let's talk about the partners. Let's talk about Bologna, and then we'll get back to Yehuda Chassid as the author, because that plays into there. As you talk about in the book, and you mentioned here, you have these manuscripts floating around. We're going to put aside Parma for a long time. You have these manuscripts floating around. Suddenly, 1538, and a printed edition of Sefer Chasidim, written by Rav Yehuda HaChassid, comes to press in Bologna. Okay, let's talk about Bologna. The city of Bologna and its Jews is kind of a unique place. It ends up part of the Papal States. Let me speak. You can follow up on me, but I'll just say I've said this in the podcast many times. For those who know that I'm interested in Italy and Italian Jewry. So Italy is city-states. This is not a country till the 19th century. Bologna ends up falling under the Papal States. The Pope was a king at the time, and he had large parts of Italy. Not all of it, of course, far from it. And Bologna was one of the ones that falls into his hands. Then, where post 1492, as you mentioned, the Spanish expulsion occurs. Many Spanish exiles end up in Italy. So Italy is kind of a mix of Italian Jews, Spanish Jews. You have German Jews that come to Ashkenazim. It's a mix of a lot of different things. And we end up in the city of Bologna. So you can talk a little bit about the city of Bologna and its Jews at this time in the 16th century. And then we get to the partners, as we'll call them, and the printers, who are the printers of the Sefer Chasidim.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, you gave a great resume of the background. This is a city that is under the control of the Pope. The Pope is the king of this city, and this is a city at this point, and he has been for several decades, and he is tolerating the presence of Jews in the city, and the Jews are providing him, as they so often do in this period, to the Christian monarchs. They're providing the merchants of these cities with capital, with and credit. And one of their roles is to provide them with credit so that they can do business. And so Jews become an essential feature of European cities because of their ability to provide credit to the Christian sovereigns. And so many of the Jews in Bologna are involved in this enterprise. Some of them are also involved in the silk business. And this is fascinating aspect of the story because the partners are call themselves Hashutafim Osei Malechet Hameshi, right? They are those who work in silk, and that's how they declaim themselves on the front on the title page of their book. In fact, Yehuda Chassid is not mentioned on the title page of their book. They are mentioned. This is Sefer Chasidim of the Shutafim. And some of these men, at least two, were involved in the silk business. Now, how Jews get involved in the silk business is interesting. Bologna is one of the most important centers of silk production in the 16th century. It for all kinds of reasons, which are too arcane to get into at this moment, silk is being produced and it's very, very desirable. People all over Europe want it, and they want the very fine silk from Bologna. And Bologna has basically what one scholar has called a quasi-industrial mode of producing silk. They can produce a lot of it fast at high quality. In the 16th century, and some of the Jews of the city, it seems, Sephardim from exiles from Spain, who may have worked in silk in Spain, come to Bologna, also work in silk there, and they use it seems that they use the capital, the money that they have made in the production of silk. They use that to underwrite the costs of starting to produce Hebrew books. Now, Hebrew printing, you can't just go and open up a Hebrew press in the 16th century. You need permission. You need permission from the ruler, that in this case, it's the Pope. And so these guys, the leader of them being Avraham ben Moshe Cohen, who is a senior rabbinic figure, maybe the leading rabbi in Bologna, an exile from Spain himself, and at this point probably getting up in years, so a highly respected individual. He it seems has some is one of the leaders of this initiative to produce these books, and he has a connection. He has connections to the Pope. The Pope gave him a personal condotta, that is a personal license to live in Bologna. He didn't have to wear the badge that Jews had to wear in this period. He was allowed not to wear the badge. And it seems one of the reasons why was because he had a library that he brought with him from Spain, that he was able to bring from Spain. And this library was very desirable, that the non-Jews of Bologna and all over the Papal States wanted to consult his library of books. This was a period when Christians were very interested in Hebrew literature. And so Avraham ben Moshe Cohen has this privilege, and so he and a number of other rabbis, among them Italian Jews, that is, Jews who trace their lineage back to Italy and perceive themselves as Italiani, that Italian, and Sephardim, Jews who trace their lineage to Spain, they begin a lobbying effort to get a condotta, to get a license to begin to print Hebrew books, and they succeed in doing it. And the license that they get is gives them the permission to print a number of books. The license specifies works, biblical works. It specifies, interestingly enough, the Birkat Hamazon, that they could print the Birkat Hamazon, although they never do. It specifies that they might print a Hebrew grammar book, Dikduk. That is interesting because Christians were very interested in Hebrew grammar. So the Pope might have wanted them to produce a Hebrew grammar book so that Christians, so that his employees, as it were, could go and learn Hebrew grammar. They never end up producing the grammar. The license does not permit them, does not mention anything about Sefer Chasidim. But what it does say specifically is that whatever they produce shall not blaspheme the church or Jesus, and that is an important qualification, and leads to some particular influences the way they create this book.
So some other things, Bologna, as you mentioned, I forgot that at this time the Ravage Sforno's there as well.
Yes,
one of the other works that they print at this press, not many. They print the commentary of Menachem Rekanati, which is just recently redone, and his halakha work that's redone recently, a year or two ago, in new edition. Or Amim, the Sforno's work in philosophy, against philosophy. They also print a Machzer with the Sforno's commentary on Pirkei Avos. They also print a Siddur. they print some other a bunch of other works as well, besides for Sefer Chasidim as well, which is interesting. So, as I think you did mention, the head of the partners, the main one, Rav Cohen, he's a Spanish exile. Who are the other partners, and
so the other partners?
How did they get to a press, or to a press, and especially to Sefer Hasidim? How did they get there?
This is. I mean, we again, as this any of these periods, this period is shrouded in mystery. We have details, but we don't have the whole story. So we have to use some supposition. But so first of all, we have Avraham ben Moshe Cohen. We know him. He's a very, very he's a known figure. We have another fellow named Menachem ben Avraham Mimodna. Why is he's important? Because he seems to be the one who was in charge of the diplomacy with the Pope. We have a fellow named Rabbi Yechiel of Verona. Now he's we don't know much about him, but then we have Rabbi Don Aryeh of Monselice. Now the fact that he has Don in front of his name, that's the Spanish, honorific, indicates that he was also likely an exile from Spain, and Monselice, where his ancestry is, or his recent where he associates himself with was a site where exiles from Spain ended up as well. We don't know much about these figures, except we know that some of them, at least, were involved in the silk business. Don Aryeh, my own research seems to indicate that Don Aryeh was involved, was most certainly involved in the silk business. He had a license to engage in a silk trade. But then you mentioned Sforno, Rav Ovadia Sforno. Sforno being, he's most known. I think he's best known for his commentary on the Chumash today, which is included in many standard editions of the Mikrot Gedolot. He was also a philosopher and published this book Or Amim, which has also received a lot of attention in recent years. There was a big conference a few years ago about it. It's hard to quite know, to categorize what it is. Is it pro philosophy, against philosophy? Is it pro Maimonides? It's against Maimonides. I think the best way one of the best ways to think about it is something like that. It is an attempt, as philosophy is waning among the Jews and Kabbalah is rising. It's an attempt to make philosophy legitimate in spite of the challenges that it poses to some of the core Jewish doctrines. So he's trying to to moderate his stance, perhaps there. You also have the involvement of Azaria de Rossi. Exactly what his involvement is hard to say, but we know that he wrote a poem in one of the partners' books, a book called Torah Or. And Azaria de Rossi is interesting because he was later in the century becomes well known for writing a book called Sefer Me'orei Naim, which is a historical book that reads the Agadah of the Talmud in light of Roman history, for instance, among the many things it does. A recent edition of that as well. So you have all of these figures are involved in this Hebrew press. Why would they want to print books? Well, I think this is an important question. It seems that you mentioned a number of the liturgical works. Actually, I'm writing at the moment. I'm working on that Machzor that you mentioned, the Machzor from 1540, because it becomes the standard Machzor of the Bnei Roma. That is the Roman Jewish rite, and it's used. It continues to be the standard for that. I'm very interested in that book and what it says about Italian Jewish culture, but. So they do print those liturgical works, right, and a siddur as well. But in the 16th century, there's demand for books that are not necessarily siddurim machzorim, that are not, they're not Talmudim, they're not the first order core texts of the library. There's people want more diversity, and here is an attempt to reach the masses with other editions of other works that are generally unknown or unavailable. So Sefer Chasidim is of course one of those books. They're interested in producing other books that haven't yet come to light. They produce a volume of the Sheilot Utshuvot of the Rashba which included Tshuvot that had yet to be printed. They produced this work Torah Or, which is a defense of it's basically a defense of Judaism. That by Yosef ibn Yahya. That's a new work. Again, the Oramim is a new work, right? And the Machzor is interesting because it really is a complete Machzor. The whole year, everything is there, in the Haggadah, right? And you have new elements to it. You have a commentary on the liturgy written by a fellow named Rabbi Yochanan Treves, who reads the liturgy in light of the Zohar, which has yet to be printed. But it's a Kabbalistic commentary on the Zohar. That's new in this period. So there is a desire there seems to be a demand for new kinds of Hebrew books, and this press is trying to satisfy that desire. And they do so with nine different volumes, nine different titles, and then they disappear. And in 1540, that's the last book. We don't know what happens to them, but we could speculate.
So a couple things just to mention. Aramim, I'm sure I mentioned this in the past, but Aramim not only mentioned there's a conference. I think they're working on a new critical edition of it.
Yes,
Sforno himself translates this book into Latin.
Yes.
And he dedicates it to King Henry II of France. His wife is Catherine de' Medici, who's Italian. And Sforno dedicates it to there. So Sforno, this is what Roger Sforno does with this work. Now, another thing as well to mention, Machzer Mega Berema, like you mentioned, a Machzer doesn't mean like today we think of a Machzer, you go for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, you have a Machzer. A Machzer here means year-round, a cycle. So it has everything in that work. Rechen and Trevis's commentary, Kimcha Davi Shuna, is in there. But what's interesting about this press is, as we mentioned, works of the Sforno, Recanati, Menachem Recanati, another Italian, Sforno's Italian, Machzer Mega Berema, others. And then we get to this decidedly Ashkenazic work, Sefer Chasidim, how do we have any inkling of how they end up publishing Sefer Chasidim?
Well, I think you actually, so I think we can come up, we have some hypotheses, and you offered one observation, which I think is important, which is you noted that, right, this edition emerges in Bologna. The major manuscript that we have that is published in the 19th century also is from Italy, from Parma. Some other manuscripts that we have are from Italy. There is interest in Sefer Chasidim among the Italians. That is on the Italian peninsula. It may also be so when we look at the colophon, that is the closing words at the end of the Sefer of the Bologna Sefer Chasidim. Those are words spoken by Avraham ben Moshe HaKohen, and he says there that this was my book. Now that's interesting. He's originally from Spain. Did he find a manuscript in Italy and it was from his library? He says this was from my library, or did he have it from Spain? And there may be a manuscript we know that Sefer Chasidim and the traditions of Chasidei Ashkenaz migrated southward to Spain. We need only, they're cited in the Torah, for instance. What is clear is that Sefer Chasidim, while it is decidedly Ashkenazic, actually managed to travel around Europe and move southward in the intervening centuries after the 13th century. So yes, it is decidedly Ashkenazic, but if you look at all of the books that the partners print, what you see is an attempt to what I call a kind of universal Jewish library. They produce books that are geared towards the Italians, geared towards the Spanish Jews, and geared towards the Ashkenazim. In fact, interestingly enough, the Siddur that they publish actually follows the liturgy, the rites of the Bnei Roma, but then it includes Ashkenazic material too. Right, so there is this attempt to gather together the accumulated Jewish tradition from across Europe and produce at this press. And that goal of trying to gather together the accumulated Jewish tradition, regardless of its place of origin, is very much 16th century. It is a Renaissance style goal. It's not all that different, when you I have an interest in the more recent history of Jewish book publishing and digitization. And if you read the mission statement of HebrewBooks.org, they say explicitly, we're trying to collect all Hebrew wisdom, the whole Megillah in one database, right? So now the partners of Bologna don't say that explicitly, but if you look at the 9 books that they print, you see that they're trying to bring together the collected wisdom of the Jewish people.
So they end up with Sefer Chasidim, which, as you say, on the title page. So in the book you have a facsimile of this, and I'm assuming it's on Hebrew Books. I didn't check, but I'll just say the title page is just kind of this blank, large sheet of paper, but it says in the middle, Sefer Chasidim Nitfas Poi Bologna, printed here in Bologna, Al Yidei Shutfim. Yitzav, Yishmereu, Tzureu, whatever it is, Lamed Yud Aleph. And then that's the title page. I'm trying to find where the pages that they say Yehuda Chassid, where you have that. So they say they don't. That's on the.
So I should just say the book includes a number of illustrations, facsimiles, plates from the editions. Also editions from the Clow Library in Cincinnati. The Clow Library is an extraordinary library, which basically has every printed Hebrew book in the 16th century, and one of the largest collections in North America. I mean, aside from the National Library of Israel, really extraordinary place. So I'm grateful to them for providing me with the images. But if you look at the introduction. You see a few lines down you're looking at the book. You can see it. It's above where it says Sefer HaChasidim. It says Kasher Asa Ha'adir HaKadosh Rabbeinu Yehuda HaChasid. So you have this the statement not on the title page, crucially, not on the title page, but in the introduction to the book, that this book was made by Yehuda HaChasid.
So so we talked about the authorship before, and was it Yehuda HaChasid or not? But this is kind of established by them.
What I am arguing is that this is like the line in the sand. If there was any doubt about who wrote this book previously, boom, this is now where we get the sense that Yehuda Chassid is the author. This is also a time when there are a lot of interest in Yehuda Chassid, it seems, in this period. The Maisa Buch, before we talked about this, is a very important book of stories that kind of like best-selling Jewish literature in the period. There are a number of stories about Yehuda Chassid and the miracles that he accomplishes in the Maisa Buch. So it seems that there are any number of reasons why it would be associated with him, but he was becoming a known quantity in this period.
And like you said, I think well, you didn't say this. I think you mentioned in the book where I think there are two passages somewhere in a commentary on Torah that his son attributes this to him. So
Yes.
that's where we know there is some actual manuscript material that does say that he is the author. Again, it's kind of an open book, what we went through before, different things, added it, not, I think Marcus says it's an open book, things are added, but it is Yehuda Chassid. It's not, it's kind of, again, regardless, I think it's important to emphasize that regardless, this is from the Chasidei Ashkenaz, it's from that period of Bali Tosis in Germany. I think that it's important to emphasize, even if it's not him, but even if it's just attributed to him, they try to give an author. But this kind of first, like you said, the line in the sand that it gets established, it's Yehuda Chassid, comes from the Partners edition.
Yes, exactly. And we should note, I mean, I'll just quote David Shayevitz, Professor David Shayevitz, who notes, right, that we do have a manuscript of Yehuda Chassid's Perush on the Chumash, where in one place, which was written by his son, Moshe Zaltman. And in there, in one place, it does say in that manuscript, two dapim of Sefer Chasid. I witnessed my father writing two dapim of Sefer Chasidim. So, I don't think it's reasonable to conclude that of Yehuda Chasid's association with this work. That's not in doubt. What is important to note is that those that exists in only a very incidental manuscript tradition. It doesn't appear widely known that this book was associated with him prior to the printing. In point of fact, Sefer Chasidim says, the very words of Sefer Chasidim say that someone who writes a book should not write it in his own name. Anyone who writes a book should write it anonymously. So it's understandable that Sefer Chasidim would not have traveled around attached to the name Yehuda Chassid.
Right. And so, like you say, and this becomes something that they establish. They say this is definitely Yehuda Chassid. But the other part about it is that there's so many different passages, different manuscripts. We get this edition, we get the other one, and we're going to talk about shortly how even they take the manuscripts and make changes. And then the Basel edition starts making changes. But let's talk about their edition. So first of all, it's an octavo. Explain what an octavo is and how their book looks, and then what the process is. How do they take the manuscript or manuscripts and then create this book?
Right. So, I will say the first thing is when we talk about format, the size of the book. So, the first Hebrew books very often existed in folio editions, which are big. You can't carry them around. You can't put them in your pocket. You can't travel with them easily. They're like your big Sfarim that you purchased today. An octavo is meant for carrying. We call it octavo because basically in this period, multiple pages of the book were printed on a single sheet of paper. And then that sheet of paper was folded, in this case, 8 times, octo, right? And those 8 folds made 8 pages, which were then which were a little booklet, which was then bound up together with other booklets to create the book. Even if you look at many books today, they're also made out of these little booklets that are gathered together. So an octavo is much more portable, much more inexpensive. Now, still expensive. Your average, and here Shifra Baruchson Arbib, professor at Bar Ilan, has really done a lot of research on this, on the costs of books. This book was probably, we don't know what it sold for. We don't have any price tags, as it were, but we have a sense that it probably was it was expensive, but not unbelievably expensive. And we know that because we have a lot of copies of it that are around that still exist, it circulated pretty widely. That was your first question, was it the octavo? What was the second question was?
How do they take the manuscripts? They take various manuscripts and then they create this Sefer Chasidim. Because even theirs, it's not just copying straight out of a manuscript. In this, I mentioned Dr. Yaakov Meir's book and the podcast that I did with him on Tfus Rishon on the first edition of the Yerushalmi. And that's really what a lot of we discussed there, how they took these manuscripts and created the Yerushalmi that we have today. Similar type of thing happens here, although we'll get to the Basel edition. But what happens here that they take one manuscript, two manuscripts, multiple manuscripts, and they create this work of Sefer Chasidim? What is that editing process?
Yes.
What do they do?
So because we don't have the exemplum, right? We don't have the text where, unlike Yaakov, right? We don't have the exemplum, the text that the partners use to create this, right? So we don't. What we have is a whole host of manuscripts which look in different ways, and then we have the printed book. And then we also do have Avraham ben Moshe Cohen's words that this book was. I had a Tofes with me in my library, and I brought it out. He says to be published, and gave it to the partners to publish. One of the things that I have discerned here is that you have in this edition very clearly that it's at least a joining together of two different manuscripts, because towards the end of the book, there's a whole series of simanim which are introduced with the heading, and this is from another Sefer Chasidim Acher. And that and there are other clues that would indicate that was the language that the printers used to join together two manuscripts. Perhaps there were more manuscripts that they joined together, but I don't want to speculate about it. But what I can also say is that they did a whole host of other things that were new. For instance, they added a table of contents. Table of contents was a feature of 16th century books, but it's not a big feature of manuscripts. So they add a big table of contents. They add a title page, right? They add a colophon, that note at the end. They engage in a kind of censoring of the text, and we're familiar with this. It's not that they block words out, but they change the text. They replace controversial words that the church might have been troubled by, that their boss, the Pope, might have been troubled by, and they remove some of them from the text. And this is not unusual, but it is a way of one needs to ask the question. This is a question I ask in the book. How did readers perceive this text now? Right? Did that change? Did the replacements that they made, for instance, when they replaced the word goy with nochri, that very likely didn't matter very much to the readers who understood what was there. But there are other places where the changes might be more significant, might have changed the meaning in certain cases of the passages. And they did that in order to abide by the rules set by their license. They had to do that. One of the things, as I said, if we're going to engage in speculation, it's always dangerous to do this, but we don't know why their business closed. They only published nine titles, but it's possible that the Pope got wind of the fact that some of the material, even with the censorship they did in Sefer Chasidim and in some of their other books, that the Pope might still have been unhappy with them, and so told them that they couldn't print anymore. It's possible.
And in the book, you have a number of passages. You compare them side by side. You take Partner's edition, and then you take manuscripts. Parma, you mentioned a couple, one in JTS, one in the Bodley, and from the Oppenheimer, of David Oppenheimer's collection. So you compare a number of them. As you said, you talk about censorship, comments about Christians. They take shaved head or priest, reference to monk, and they make it secular. They take a foreigner. I'm just reading the English translation you translate. They don't go with that. Now, one other thing about this, you mentioned the introduction, the colophon, but there is also a table of contents here. How unique?
Yes.
Talk about that. How unique is that in 1538 to have a table of contents in a work?
Yeah, table of contents becomes a really big deal in this period, because this is one way publishers distinguish themselves. we're not just publishing the book. We're going to give you a handy dandy table of contents. It's going to make it really easy, a mafteach for the book, right? And that's going to make it easier for you to read and get and get meaning from it. So table of contents this is a period. Professor Ann Blair of Harvard has written about this extensively. This is a period when in Europe tables of contents are being produced extensively. And in the medieval world, tables of contents, particularly of the style are rare. Now, not entirely unheard of, but rare. And so we actually have only one manuscript. We have one manuscript of Sefer Chasidim, which has something that looks like a table of contents. But unlike the table of contents in the Partners edition, which is meant really to be a kind of it's 50 pages, this table of contents. It's very long. And really, if you read it, you get a very good idea of what Sefer Chasidim is about. It's almost like a summary of the book. Whereas the manuscript table of contents actually conveys very, very, very little about the meaning of the various simanim. What it shows is the number of the siman and then the first few words of it. And it seems like that table of contents in the manuscript was designed by the Sefer to help to check that he had each of the correct passages. We have this, we have this, we have this. But based on the first few words, but it didn't actually convey anything really about the passages themselves. The table of contents that we find in the Partners edition is actually meant to provide content. It's meant to be an educational tool to make the book more accessible.
And this is unlike the Basel edition, which the table of contents is more like the manuscripts. Let's talk about the Basel edition. As you title chapter 4, Ambrosius Froben of Basel, or if I'm pronouncing his name right. So he's a non-Jew in charge of this press, which was common. You obviously have Daniel Bomberg in Venice with the famous Bomberg press and other ones, Giustiani and Bragadini and all these other non-Jews publishing. They employ Jews. They have them working on these books. So he gets involved. I mean, you can talk about him a little bit in the book. You go very in-depth in him. I don't know if we're going to go super in-depth about him here. And they print this edition, which differs, the second edition in 1580.
It differs, yes. And so Froben is, is your comparison to Bomberg is completely right. Perhaps the difference is that Froben comes from a family of printers who have been printing since the early part of the century, and Ambrosius pretty quickly after he takes over his father Hieronymus's business, goes into the Hebrew book business, and let's question, why would a non-Jewish guy go into the Hebrew book business? Well, again, just as it was for the Partners, there was money to be made here. I don't think this was. I don't think he had religious motives in the same way that the Partners did, but he definitely had financial motives. He also, I think, it's fairly certain he recognized that there's a burgeoning market for Hebrew books in Poland. Now, Froben was also known for printing an edition of the Talmud almost at the same time as the Sefer Chasidim edition. And that edition of the Talmud is well known as the censored Basel Talmud. It's censored because it's censored. In fact, Masechet Avodah Zarah does not exist in it because it's produced under the auspices of the Pope. That Talmud edition was produced for the Jews of Poland. Froben got an investment from a Jewish bookseller named Simon and Shimon, and it's clear that Shimon wanted Froben to produce this new edition of the Talmud, which he does, and very quickly the partnership is dissolved because Shimon is not pleased with the quality of the book. Froben continues to print Hebrew books and also Yiddish books, notably a number of important Yiddish books he produces, especially later in his life when he moves to the town of Freiburg. And one of the books that he produces is Sefer Chasidim, and he says, to do this he certainly employs Jews, Yisrael Sifroni being the primary the manager of the press, and he also a fellow named Rabbi Yaakov Lutzato was involved in this operation. This is unusual because it was prohibited for Jews to live in Basel at this time. So Froben had to get permission from the town council of Basel, which at this time was Protestant, to bring a Jew into the city, and he gets permission to bring Sifroni. And perhaps we don't have evidence, we don't have the licenses for it, but others as well. But we also know that non-Jews were employed there too, working in the print shop and putting the book together. And in fact, in the colophon to one of his books, Sifroni complains that, "I'm so sorry for this book. This book, unfortunately, we had to do it quickly, and it was over the Chagim, and I couldn't supervise the Christians who were working the printing press those days. And so if there are errors, it's their fault." That's not Sefer Chasidim, but that's another book called Kavanot HaAgadot. But it's clear that Christians were involved, and that Froben edition is somewhat different from the Basel edition in very important ways. The censorship, for instance, is much greater. Interestingly, there expressions in Yiddish are removed from the text. Not all, but several prominent ones are. Also, words that were that the partners in the first edition might have not considered offensive were removed or changed in the second edition. We have Notzri becomes Tzadoki, for instance, and Komrim become Mishartei Avodah Zarah, or Mitzri, etc. So we have more extensive changes as well in that edition too, and notably Yehuda Chassid's name appears on the front cover.
So, a couple of things here to comment on. First of all, as you mentioned, and we already mentioned, the table of contents here is different. The work differs a bit. So what kind of impact does this have today on Sefer Chasidim? As I said, we have the Parma edition, which is totally different. I think the Eitzar Paiskim has a new edition of that, plus the regular, I'm not sure. But regardless, the Mosar of Korkut, the Prof. Margolis' commentary, is the classic. That one is based on which edition?
It's much closer to the Froben second edition than to the Bologna first edition.
Any reason why?
Yeah, this is interesting, and I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. I would actually like if there are any listeners actually who have an insight into Reuven Margoliot's commentary and his process, etc. I'd love to know if you have an insight on why that particular text was chosen. It's not exactly the Froben text, I should say, but it's much closer to the Froben text than the Bologna text.
Okay, so that is one thing. And as we said, there is the Parma. And then, like I mentioned, there's the Eitzar Paiskim. It's like 4 volumes. One volume is the Tzava, the famous will, and there they include a lot of commentaries, other commentaries. I mean, there's a lot of.
So let
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just say that about commentaries. I think that's worth noting, right? And those the first two editions, you don't have commentaries. Actually, well, that's not quite right. In the Froben edition, you have brief perushim that happen in parenthetical in parentheses in the text, usually with pei chupchik afterwards, and that's fascinating because it seems to me that those perushim are meant to make this text, which sometimes includes rather arcane, difficult phrases or words, clearer to readers who might not be as familiar with but arcane and difficult, not necessarily for Jews, but for non-Jews who would be interested in reading this book. So the perushim function in that way, but that's not a perush in this way that we would, in a full-scale perush, right? That actually comes about in 1639. In addition, that way from 1639, it may either be from Krakow or Lublin, and it includes a commentary by Rabbi Sadia Chalavna. We actually only have partially this edition. We have fragments of it, and we also then there are other commentaries. There's a commentary produced in Frankfurt by Rabbi David Aptrod, 1724, and then a commentary most interesting by Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai from 1789. That is interesting because that commentary comes out in a standalone book. Its first edition is a standalone book, not necessarily as an edition of Sefer Chasidim, but as the commentary itself, worth greater study. That's another project for me. So the commentaries begin to emerge in the 17th century. Okay, but if you think about commentaries, and this is Elchanan Reiner, Professor Elchanan Reiner has talked about the way commentary functions to canonize our texts. Right? When something achieves a commentary, it becomes a part of the tradition with a capital T, you see that process even happening earlier in the Froben text. And I'll tell you why. Not with those perushim so much as with the typeface of the Froben text. The Froben text of Sefer Chasidim is in the square text, the square Hebrew text, which indicate, unlike the Bologna text, which is in a semi-cursive, the Rashi script. So when something appears in the square text, it immediately has a greater weight to it, import, and canonicity. And that is what we see with the Froben text. And then the production of commentaries several decades later just continues that process, such that between 1538, as I said, and 1891, you have 50 editions almost of Sefer Chasidim, which is a large number. Many of them, I should also say, in Poland, right? And that's because of the interest of Polish Jewry, and also in the period of Chassidut, right? The period of Hasidism, because there's an interest, there's a desire to link the Hasidic movement of the Baal Shem Tov and his successors with the Hasidei Ashkenaz earlier on.
Now that you've studied all this and we discussed this, so what does this say about, what does this tell us about the Sefer Hasidim we have today? I mean, we mentioned the different editions, but so it's essentially, I mean, and you mentioned the author of B'to Chassid or not, so it's essentially just to sum it up, I mean, it's a collection, various manuscripts. This edition picked it this way, this edition picked it a little differently. Parma is just a completely different manuscript tradition. And if you go online, you can see the other manuscripts. You can see the other traditions that alongside the Parma manuscript that show different materials as well. And so in some ways, actually, in the digital world where you have the website now, where you can look at 20 different manuscripts of Sefer Chasidim side by side, the open book has been, the closed book has been reopened, right?
it's been reopened, we can now see the various editions, compare them, where we couldn't do that. We could do that in a rudimentary way beginning in the 19th century, and then really only in the last several decades. So without a doubt, but also, and here I want to cite the work of Professor Ted Fram, because he has shown how Sefer Chasidim has entered into the tradition of Psak Halacha in the Ashkenazic world in the years after the printing edition. It acquires, and also not just Psak Halacha, but also the world of Musar, of the literature of Musar, of homiletical literature, and that it through it's being quoted by Ashkenazi authorities in Poland, beginning in the 17th century, 18th century, first by it being printed in Bologna, and then printed in Poland, and then printed in Basel, and then printed in Poland. And it's being spread. It then enters into the broader halachic literature and the literature of the minhagim and the literature of Musar, and it becomes it becomes normalized and a kind of fixed part of the tradition, standardized. So now everyone knows Sefer Chasidim, right? It's Sefer Chasidim. It's become a part of the normative religious tradition of Ashkenazi Jewry in this way, and that is because of printing. It is because of the book first being printed, and then it becoming canonical, as it were, and entering into the tradition, and then being quoted regularly, commented on, and then quoted regularly.
Right, and it becomes, many listeners are familiar with Sefer Chasidim, and they've probably learned Sefer Chasidim. I've seen it quoted, like you said, in Allah and other areas, and it's, this kind of canonical, famous, very important Sefer. Basically, final question here. What does this tell us about other works? As I mentioned, Dr. Yaakov Meir's work a bunch of times, and that's different because we have the actual copy they use, the inky fingers you see. So this is a little different. But what does this kind of tell you? I think Sefer Chasidim. But what does it tell us about other things?
And I think this is the chap. This is like the big point in this story. I would argue that this book is part of a now developing, and it's not just in the Jewish world, by the way, in the broader academy, awareness of what is called the materiality of texts. That texts exist as material objects, that they have particular histories. And if you read my book and Yaakov Meir's work, and also Danny Abrams's work on the Zohar, right, and there are others as well, all relatively recent. What you see here is an attentiveness to the way printing has changed. Was a significant moment in Jewish history where the library, the bookshelf of Judaism as we know it, comes into being. Right? It is through printing that we get the Aron HaSfarim that we know of today. It is, and I say it is ironic that our awareness of so I would say, first of all, these guys who made these books, their names should be known. We should know Avraham ben Moshe Cohen's name. We should know, Yisrael Sifroni's name and others. We should know them because they're part of the history of our texts and how they came to be the way they are in our hands. And it is ironic that at this moment in time with digitization, when now you can go online and see all the various editions and all of the manuscripts at hand, that whereas printing seemed to have created closed books, digitization is opening things up again. And we're seeing the seams, if as it were, in our books. We see that they're not, that the Defus Rishon is precisely that, just the Defus Rishon. It's among Defusim.
Yeah, now, I mean, to point out, however, that is the one that established, that's the tradition that we have comes
Yes.
from the Rishon. They had presumably greater access to manuscripts that may have been lost today and things like that. So, just to point out, but yes, it's important to understand who created these first editions, these first Rishons that we have, where it came from, how it came to be, etc. I think that's what's so fascinating about the book. Again, being somewhat of a book geeky type of guy, I enjoyed the book very much. But there is not only that in the book, there also is a lot of history. You go through Frobin, you go through the partners, so it's a nice blend of both book history and general history. So I'll put a link to the book. Like I said, it's published by Brandeis University Press. I can link to Professor Ivan Marcus's book in the show's notes as well if anyone wants to read about the open book theory. Also, you mentioned the Sefer Chasidim. There's a website, right, for that as well.
Yes, the Sefer Chasidim project.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show's notes as well if anyone is interested in checking that out. And hopefully everyone learned a little bit more about Sefer Chasidim and Abuda Chassid and the manuscript traditions and how it came to be. And thank you, Professor Skloot, for joining me.
Thanks so much. It was an honor.